Well, hey again, home learners. We are about to start a new book by Roald Dahl, this time not Owen Colfer. This one's called George's Marvellous Medicine, and it's one of my favourites. Clearly an oldie, but a goodie. This one actually belonged to my brother, but I'm sure he doesn't mind that I'm borrowing it. Illustrations by Quentin Blake. I'm going to read you the blurb in case you haven't heard of this one before. Whenever I see a slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. George's grandmother had the nastiest eating habits in the world. She's as frightening as a witch and as grumpy as a camel without a hump. When he can't stand this cantankerous old woman any longer, George decides to cure her nastiness once and for all. He concocts a very special medicine, which is as nasty as she is, and then waits for the results. Interesting. George's Marvellous Medicine. Written by Roald Dahl, illustrated by Quentin Blake. Chapter 1 is just called Grandma. It starts with a warning to all readers. Warning to readers, do not try to make George's Marvellous Medicine yourselves at home. It could be dangerous. Okay, Chapter 1, Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning. So, be good and don't get up to any mischief while I'm gone. This was a silly thing to say to a small child at any time. It immediately made them wonder what sort of mischief they could get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, his mother said. Then out she went, closing the back door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked little eye and said, Now, you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine. No, Grandma, George said. And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away. Yes, Grandma, George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm that they lived on was miles away from anywhere. So there were never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grizzly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start, Grandma said to George. That'll keep you out of some mischief for a few minutes. Yes, Grandma, George said. George couldn't help but disliking Grandma. She was a selfish and grumpy old woman, and she had pale brown teeth and a small puckered-up mouth like a dog's bottom. How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma? George asked her. 1 spoon, she said, and no milk. Most grandmas are kind and lovely, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every day sitting in her chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grousing, grouching, grumbling and griping about something or another. Never once, not even on her best days, had she smiled at George and said, Well, how are you this morning, George? Or why don't you and I have a game of snakes and ladders? Or how was school today? She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it and no milk. He stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. It's not sweet enough, she said. Put more sugar in it. George took the cup of tea back to the kitchen and added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully to Grandma. Where's the saucer? She said. I won't have any cup of tea without a saucer. George fetched her a saucer. And what about a teaspoon, if you please? I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well. I'll stir my own tea, thank you very much, she said. Fetch me a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were home, Grandma never ordered George about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began to treat him badly. You know what's the matter with you? The old woman said, staring at George over the rim of her teacup with those bright, wicked little eyes. You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy. But I can't help it if I'm growing fast, Grandma, George said. Of course you can, she snapped. Growing's a nasty, childish habit. But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups. Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not. But you did once, Grandma. Only a very little, the old woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childish habits like laziness and disobedience and greed and sloppiness and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of those things, have you? I'm only a little boy, Grandma. You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's enough to know better. If you don't stop growing soon, it'll be too late. Too late for what, Grandma? Oh, it's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took one good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short that she had to have a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up the armchair. Dad said it's fine for me to grow nice and tall, George said. Don't listen to your daddy, Grandma said. Listen to me. But how do I stop myself from growing? George asked her. Eat less chocolate, Grandma said. Does chocolate make you grow? It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some of her tea but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down. Yes, Grandma. And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead. Oh, cabbage? No, I don't like cabbage, George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in it, so much better. Ugh, George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said. Mummy washes them down the sink, George said. Mummy's just as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too. Not slugs, George cried out. I wouldn't eat slugs. Whenever I see a slug on a piece of lettuce, Grandma said, I gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. She squeezed her lips together so tight that her mouth became a tiny wrinkled hole. Delicious, she said again. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you. You're joking, Grandma. She doesn't look like she's joking. I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps the best of all. They go crunch. Grandma, that's beastly. The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle inside the stem of a stick of celery. Oh, that's what I like. Grandma, said George, how could you? You find all sorts of things in sticks of raw celery, the old woman went on. Sometimes it's even earwigs. I don't want to hear about it, cried George. A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you've got to be quick, my dear, because when you put one of those in your mouth, it has a sharp pair of nippers on its back end and it grabs your tongue with nose. It never lets go. So you've got to bite the earwig first, chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away as possible from this filthy old woman. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door staring at the old hag in the chair. and then she stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He had always thought that witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. "Come closer to me," she said, beckoning him with one finger. "Come closer to me and I will tell you secrets." George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. "I know a great many secrets," she said, and suddenly she smiled. She smiled, a thin, icy smile. It was the kind that a snake might make just before it bites you. "Come over here to Grandma and she'll whisper secrets to you." George took a step backwards, edging closer towards the door. "You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma," she said, smiling that icy smile. George took another step backwards. "Some of us," she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in her chair and whispering in a sort of throaty voice that George had never heard her use before. "Some of us," she said, "have magic powers that can twist the creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes." A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. "Some of us," the old woman went on, "have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tip of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand up straight on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets." George wanted to run away, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. "We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead." George began to tremble. It was her face that frightened him most of all. That frosty smile, and most of all, those brilliant, unblinking eyes. "We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you." "Grandma!" he cried. "Stop!" "We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other." George made a dive for the door. "It doesn't matter how far you run," he heard her saying. "You won't ever get away." George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. That's the end of the first chapter. Well, that was a creepy first chapter and start to the story. The next chapter is called The Marvellous Plan. So it looks like maybe things are looking a little bit up for George after this chapter. Hope you don't get too many nightmares from that one, guys. Just kidding. It's only a story. And chapter 3, how cool, is called George Begins to Make the Medicine. So I think that Grandma might be getting what's coming to her very soon. Hope to see you in the next one, guys. Have a lovely day. Bye.